All right, I know it's been a long time, but we're coming back to something a little bit different here today. So instead of doing homebrew for the Imperial Guard, we're going to discuss a little bit of lore. So we're going to talk about the question, how many ships are in the Imperial Navy as a whole across the Imperium of Man? So from Battlefleet Gothic, we know a few things. So we know that the average sector has 50 to 75 ships. And we also know the average sector size, at least using the Gothic sector as an example, and that's often touted to be an average across the Imperium, is about 85 planets. Now, that is going from memory, so I do know it could be slightly incorrect. You're welcome to go to any of the fan wikis and count the physical number of planets. I did see quite a lot listed there, but not an exact number. So, yeah, you're more than welcome to count them and come back to me. That's not a problem. But I'm going to do a couple of examples to go around that number anyway. So I'm not going to be using that exact number for our examples here. So anyway, we also know that the Imperium has roughly 1 million worlds. So using all these figures, we can get a fairly accurate representation of how many ships we have across the Imperial Navy. So if we take 1 million worlds and go for a lower estimate, we divide that by 125 planets. That gives us 8,000 sectors across the Imperium. And then if we times that by 50 ships per sector, we get 400,000. Now, this is the lowest possible estimate I would even use. I do not believe that number myself. That's far too small. The next one's more of a middle-of-the-road option. So we get 1 million worlds, divide 100 planets per sector. That gives us 10,000 sectors, and we times that by 62.5. So that's bang on the middle between 50 and 75. That gives us 625,000 ships. Now, that sounds a lot more reasonable. It's 50%, well, over 50% more than our original figure. And then if we go for a higher estimate, so we use 1 million worlds divided 80 planets per sector. That gives us 12,500 sectors. Times that by 75, so the upper limit. That gives us 937,500 ships. Now, I think that might be a little bit too much, and that the true number is somewhere between the two figures, the two latter figures, so somewhere between 937,500 and 625,000. Now, why do I believe that? Well, you also have to consider that in this setting, there's 1 million Marines. So now with Primarius introduced, there's probably more than that. But prior to that, up until the destruction of Cadia and before the rebirth of Guilliman, well, not rebirth, but the resurrection of Guilliman, there's 1 million Marines. So having less than 1 million combat-capable vessels makes sense, especially when you consider that it's not just the Imperial Navy that has combat vessels. It's also the Adeptus Mechanicus, Space Marines. Rogue traders can be used as mercenaries with their own cruiser-class vessels. There's also the Ecclesiarchy that owns their own private military naval vessels. And then there's also things like black ships. Obviously, they're not in combat, but they could be used in combat. And then you also have to consider the scale of the transport network across the Imperium. So what do I mean by that? Is that the actual scope of intergalactic trade in the Imperium is almost beyond belief. Like, it probably could not be estimated how many merchant vessels there are across the Imperium. So we're talking about actual transport cargo vessels here now rather than the Imperial Navy. So basically, the Imperium, industrial worlds, dockyards, Forge World dockyards, they're going to be primarily focused pumping out as many trading vessels and repairing as many trading vessels as possible. Because imagine the scale of trying to feed a single hive world of, say, 100 billion people on purely food and water imports alone. Those worlds aren't making their own food to sustain themselves. They've run out of water, like their own planet's water, a long time ago. And their recycling methods cannot be 100% perfect. That is physically impossible. and then multiply that for every single hive world in the Imperium, including Terra, which is the biggest hive world in the Imperium, and that's said to have quadrillions of people on it alone. So the economics of the Imperium and the scale of actual trade is staggering. It is such a crazy thing to think about. There would be millions, if not billions, of cargo vessels across the Imperium. Without those, the Imperium as a whole ceases to function. You'll have entire populations of hive worlds starving. You'll have forge worlds not receiving like raw materials to make goods, war materials. They can't build those. They can't transport those to planets that need those war materials. They can't transport troops to planets that need reinforcement. Or they can't use those soldiers for crusades to, take worlds that have already been lost or conquer new worlds. It just crashes down. And then another thing to consider is that those same merchant vessels, they're armed. They're not defenseless. A lot of them have light macro batteries. If you get enough cargo vessels, they themselves could blockade a planet if that planet doesn't have any kind of anti-void weaponry. Because even a light macro cannon is going to be more powerful than, say, a regiment of basilisks, because it's a macro cannon. As I said earlier, macro cannons, they can level mountains. A lance battery can boil oceans. That's how devastating these kind of weapons are. So the Navy conscripts merchantmen in times of crisis. During the Gothic War, thousands of merchant craft were conscripted to fight against chaos. And then that's just standard transports and cargo vessels. There's other more heavily armored ones as well. There's called armed merchants, which sounds a little funny, but because of the name. But basically they have more military-grade macro weapons, so something that you might find on an actual frigate or even a cruiser in some cases, but it sacrifices cargo space. And then you also have Q ships. So this is kind of a throwback to World War II that Games Workshop have done. But basically what a Q ship is it gets rid of all the cargo space in the vessel entirely and then carries concealed weaponry underneath. And then you mix that ship in with a transport fleet. So basically you wait for the enemy to come close, you reveal your concealed weaponry, and then you unload onto them in a surprise engagement. But these Q ships can have enough firepower as a light cruiser as well. So these things could possibly equal the number of naval vessels across the Imperium. And just average merchant ships are like at least probably 10 times the actual figure I gave earlier for the Imperial Navy. And then that's not even talking about system fleets. So system fleets aren't warp capable. They cannot travel through the warp. They don't have the drives to do it. But what they do have is still traditional propulsion, and they can be mass produced. So something like a defense monitor might carry as much firepower as something like a sword frigate or up to a light cruiser, and it can go along the trade routes and do patrols, because all you have to do is patrol between your planet that your shipping is going from to the Mandeville point where they enter the warp. If you just maintain a patrol between those two areas, you can have a fairly constant defense. And then if you're in a system, say for example, in today's world, if we had defense monitors on Earth, we could send them to Mars to reinforce it. So a similar thing would happen in the Imperium. If a nearby world in that same system is under threat, you could use those traditional drives to send those vessels in support. Even with the PDF, you could load them into the defense monitors and transport them to that planet. You could conscript your own merchants and shove soldiers into there as well and use those to go reinforce the other planet. So the PDF don't just rely on the Imperial Guard to help them. If it's a system that's heavily populated, it's going to have layers of defense. A world itself, like say a high-tech civilized world, is going to have orbital defenses, defense monitors. It's going to have ground-based macro or torpedo or lance batteries. It's going to have PDF stationed on the planet, potentially on the moons. Could have satellites as well. It could have a system rally point somewhere that's like a orbital naval base, and that's just full of defense monitors. It could have a orbital dockyard somewhere that builds vessels in the void, which is easier to do than say building vessels on a planet and then shooting them up through atmosphere. It's ridiculous. So the main point is that I'm trying to say here today is that the Imperial Navy itself might not necessarily be large, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the Imperium is completely defenseless. The Imperial Navy's always, in the lore, been spread too thin, and that's for good reason, because their weaponry is just too devastating. But what the Imperium does have is armed merchantmen. And just like the Age of Sail that the Imperium tries to do, or I should probably say what the Games Workshop is trying to portray, is that those merchants fight a lot. There's probably privateers and stuff that the Imperium hire often on occasion. That'd be a great story to read. But the Imperial Navy fighting itself is never as many as you believe it would be. You don't see the battle over Coruscant in 40k, where it's thousands of vessels at one time. I believe in the Taros campaign, there was maybe a dozen Imperial vessels tops. I think in Siege of Varax there was half a dozen vessels that appeared, and then because the great thing about those old Imperial armor books is that they used to have rules for Battlefleet Gothic in them. Oh, that was amazing. But anyway, the scale of the actual Imperial Navy isn't as large as you might think, but the scale of the Imperium's trade network is beyond what you might think. Anyway, thanks for listening. Have a great one.